All right. So it's a thrill actually to be with an audience that understands the problems of OCR, where I don't have to explain what OCR is, and people who actually believe that analyzing material, getting information off of the printed or written page is a non-trivial task and not already done by Google Books. And I want to talk about the significance of OCR and why it really matters. And I really want to focus, if you remember nothing else of what I say, sort of the takeaway, there are three basic changes. And I think this is going to be reinforcing much of what you've heard and what you will hear today. The first, there's a transformation of the scale of questions that we can pose. And this is both in breadth and depth. And breadth, scanning through ideas across millions of documents, many languages, but depth also in that we can look at something like the text, heavily studied text of Shakespeare or of Aeschylus, and see connections and ideas that were not visible before. To some extent, this corresponds to computational and corpus linguistics and their applications to the humanities. Second, what we see, and again, a major theme, but one that cannot be emphasized too strongly, are the rise of student researchers and citizen scholars. And these figures play a critical role in the world today because there's simply too much data out there, even with clever systems, and even for this small number of advanced researchers and library professionals. We cannot, and you know better than anyone, you as a community, process everything at our disposal, everything already available with professional tasks, people alone. And the third change, is globalization. And here I'll return to this. But Europe, is complicated enough. How many languages? How many official languages in Europe do you have now? I always lose track. 20 something? More than you can learn. India, I believe, has more than 20 official languages. Also, they have 4 official classical languages. Dealing with cultural heritage is now a global activity. I'll return to this, but basically there are too many questions and too many categories of information for us to draw solely upon the usual suspects in Europe, North America, Australia, and so on. We need to have change the networks of communication. All right, now I'm going to talk today quickly. I'm going to blow through a number of slides. I hope nobody gets whiplash. With the results for a particular project, particular activity, which was funded under the Digging into Data project, and we just finished up. But it's the issue of creating dynamic variorum editions. And lots of thanks to various people. Did Alistair show up today, Alistair Dunning? Not yet. Oh, well. But I think creating a dynamic variorum is one of the grand challenges that you face when you're looking at very large collections and thinking about what you would do with OCR. And what you do with OCR, your services that you plan to develop, are in fact going to constrain the things you optimize all through the workflow. So what are you trying to accomplish at the other end? And the real issue is how do you create self-organizing collections? Because even with all the crowdsourcing in the world, you need to have as much done automatically as possible. There's an inexhaustible amount of material. Now, what is a variorum? It's short for cum notis variorum, or with notes of different people. It's a kind of edition. And basically, the idea of a variorum is an attempt to summarize everything we know about a document, all contextualizing information in a form that you can use. There's a series called the New Variorum Shakespeare series, which is maybe considered the flagship of this. And the New Variorum Shakespeare series is 140 years old. So it is not a new idea. And it's new versus the 1821 Shakespeare Variorum series, 40 years before. And of course, already in the beginning of the 19th century, the scholars who were putting these things together complained you could never possibly read everything. Information overload shows up very early. The idea of a very own edition goes back well before the 18th century. Here you have Heinsius's edition of Claudian, and from 1665 with Elsevier, even then, no doubt suing people. So this is an ancient idea, one that has deep roots, and one that we need to do automagically, as it were. And it still exists. The Nouveau Roman Shakespeare series is supported by the Modern Language Association. You can buy new editions, and it is kind of a labor of love because you simply cannot accomplish the goals of the Nouveau Roman Shakespeare today manually. It's done as a labor of love, but there's too much Shakespearean scholarship. But it is so important as an activity that people still keep trying to work at it, even though it's not really, it's just impossible. When I worked on this project 10 years ago. So as you think about what do you want to do now in the 21st century, you might go back and see what were the things people have cared about for a long time. So what was in the 1873 Nouveau Roman Shakespeare edition of Macbeth? Well, of course, you have an index, first thing you would think of. We can do a better job of that by all studies now. Table of contents, easy enough. And then sources. So how would you, if you're looking at a document, what are the sources that lie behind it? Can you detect those automatically? Because often, if you're dealing with Shakespeare, people have done a lot of work. If you're looking at an 18th century pamphlet on a particular subject, its sources may not be documented. Probably no one has studied this. And you need to be able to find as much as you possibly can. You're looking also for versions of this, so sources, things previous to what you're looking at, and then you want to see what happens to this. How does this get reused? And there are various versions of this. And you're looking for general topics. What are the ideas in a document? And how do you find information about those ideas automatically in a scalable fashion? And of course, bibliographic data, who wrote about this, what's relevant, and so on. And then finally, you want your running text. And you want multiple versions. So say you're reading Virgil, or you're reading Milton, or you're reading Homer, or you're reading some other author. You want to see the different versions of this text as they existed over time. Even if the words of the text are relatively stable, you want to be able to compare the version people were looking at in the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, because that was the artifact upon which their work depended that shaped their ideas. How do you assemble these automatically? How do you find and organize all the versions of a popular work over time? And then, of course, you want lots of annotations. You want to have lots of explanatory annotations of various kinds. Now, this is not a new problem in the digital world. Back 20 years ago at Brown, they were working on this in the Intermediate project, one of the early hypertextual projects. One of the things I always regret was I was not on the hypertext edit or program committee in 1991. For some reason or other, I didn't raise my hand that year, so I was not able to reject the World Wide Web paper that came in and was rejected from Hypertext 1991 because, of course, it was not as sophisticated as other systems, all of which have died. One of the things to bear in mind from the World Wide Web, just as I go through, is that the smartest system doesn't always win. The most useful system wins, which may be much more practical. And so this is one system that did not survive, but was wonderful at the time. And so the problem, again, it's not feasible to summarize scholarship on any major canonical author by manual means. That was bad in 1665, and in 1905, it was a lot worse. It's a lot worse today. Put another way, you organize, you give someone physical access to a document that you've OCR'd, then what? They're looking at it, so what? How do you let them actually get intellectual access? That is a very different thing. Okay. And Shakespeare's, of course, and this is a European project, so I don't have to make this case as forcefully as I do on the other side of the Atlantic, where everybody speaks English, don't they? go into the Sheraton in Beijing and they speak English. What's the problem? But Shakespeare is the easy case. What we need to think about now is the fact that we have digitized versions of writing, of language for the full preserved range of human speech. 4,000 years of the human record is available in some measure in digital form. And the challenge is to get meaning out of that. The challenge is to work not just with the 7,000 or so languages that exist today, which is quite a challenge, but even for the 400 languages represented in significant form within Google Books that represent major elements of preserved cultural heritage. We have 500 years of English for Shakespeare. That's a nice test case. It's easy for that reason. But if you deal with something like the Greco-Roman world, and I'm officially a classicist, though sometimes my dean wonders, I'm also have an appointment in computer science, and they made me chair of my department just so they could figure out what I was doing. But the Greco-Roman world is quite extensive, and we need to, it goes from Rabat to Kandahar, and we need to deal with things like papyrus. Again, this is beyond current OCR technology, but it has to be, the results of this data have to be integrated in. We have Greek into Arabic. One of the things I emphasize these days is you wouldn't be here in this room were it not for scholars in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Andalus, who took Greek learning and translated it into Arabic and created something new. Aristotle and Euclid re-entered Europe via translation from Arabic into Latin in the early medieval period. And so how do you deal with this whole range of sources? You have the return of Greek sources in 1500. How are people doing on Greek OCR here? I wish I was here yesterday so I could have asked for it. Aren't you guys Europeans? Isn't this your cultural heritage? I'm sure this is high up in your impact.
Sorry, we go for the useful.
Yeah, this is here. That's my colleague Bruce Robertson working on it. Come on, guys, you're supposed to be leading the Americans in this. This is, we're the ones who are pragmatic. You're the ones who are supposed to have culture. Okay, so, we're the Philistines. After all. So I'm going to talk, where do we stand in some of these things? And I'm going to talk mainly about the stuff in red. And this is the work for several colleagues of mine. And I'm going to spend a little time talking about computational linguistics and what it can do. And this is work done by my colleague David Bannon, working with us, who has now gone off to get a PhD in computer science at Carnegie Mellon University. And again, to emphasize, this is the Greco-Roman world. Notice a lot of that isn't part of Europe. The language most heavily spoken in the area of the old Roman Empire is not a European language. If you look at the map, what language would it be? It's Arabic, by far. 170 million people speak Arabic in the areas covered by that map. Language number 2 is Turkish. So Europe doesn't come into language number 3. The Greco-Roman world is as much the cultural heritage of the Arabic and Muslim world as it is of Europe. And I'll return to that. But what if you just deal with Latin? Latin is, again, the easy case. And a critical case if you actually want to understand where European culture comes from, because that is a story largely told in Latin. And in fact, European society sort of collapses when you move to vernaculars and you go to tribalism, you start wiping each other out. To write in Latin was to assert an identity in a cosmopolitan culture that has not existed until the 20th century, until the European Union. Okay, so what do you do if you have 2,000 years of Latin, what do you do with it? Well, I'll talk about one particular problem, which is dealing with language change. What can you do with a bunch of OCR? Noisy OCR at that. We just took the rough OCR that we got out of the Internet Archive, which was not optimized for Latin, not optimized for anything except, business documents, whatever the default is for ABBY. Thank you, Abby, for helping make this possible. And so we built up a corpus took 1.2 million words, or took 1.2 million books from the Internet Archive and looked for books that were labeled as Latin. And we got 25,886 works. And of course, we discovered they were all produced in the 19th century. So if you use the default metadata tells you, of course, when the book was printed. It does not tell you when the contents were produced. So if you're interested in language change, your library metadata is not very useful. Secondly, there's the issue of the language data. And so, in fact, thousands of these books that are listed as being in Latin aren't. So, for example, we have lots of editions that have a Latin title page and are actually Greek. They're listed as Latin. And so if you go through and do your language ID and actually analyze the language of this collection, you find out there's about, I can't remember what the precision or recall figures are, but only about 22,000 books in Latin. A bunch of them we had to find were not marked as Latin. A bunch of them were marked as Latin that weren't. The language metadata, even at the book level, is very rough. So if you're trying to do interesting things with library metadata, it doesn't work very well at scale, is one of the things you think about. Now, how do you get past that? Well, you analyze the OCR, is one thing you do. Okay, so when were these books composed? How do you actually do interesting diachronic work? Well, this is where we started. But then if you go through and you actually analyze books and create a sample, we went through 7,000 Latin works. And this is the actual distribution of Latin that we've got. Now, what you see is, of course, a biased sample, biased towards the classical period, and not very much representation in what we have for the medieval period, and an immense amount of Latin produced in the 19th century. A lot of academic prose is produced in Latin and inaccessible intellectually. If you're studying the history of science, history of botany, history of a bunch of subjects, jurisprudence, and so on. But most of the Latin that we have is post-classical. And now if you analyze the OCR, even if it's accurate, you get interesting artifacts. So here is the word for America, and you will see it as non-zero before 1492, or before the 15th century, I guess, when Amerigo Vespucci gives his name. And why do you suppose you get instances of America? Oh, no, it's title pages. It's introductions. It's because we can't segment introductions from text. So you'll have a text that mentions America in the introduction, and that's actually an American edition of Cicero. So that gets counted as being first century BCE. But if it mentions America, America should, you have, even this is very coarse metadata. You have not been able to segment the document. And you can look at, of course, at this point, given the data, when you organize things as much as this, you can start looking for things like the rise and fall of particular words. And if you look at prepositions, you can see phenomena of language moving from case to preposition over time. And you see the rise of case here, reflecting changes in vernacular. But say you have a term that is ambiguous, like oratio. Now, oratio could be either an oration or a prayer. And it's a little bit like going to Google Ngram viewers saying, well, what's the relative frequency of lead and iron, lead being possibly read as lead, when you have polysemous words? Doesn't do much for you if you're really trying to figure out lead versus lead, iron as a metal versus to iron a shirt. Okay, so you have polysemy. And how do you measure sense variation in a collection like this? Well, you can do things like, one trick is you use parallel texts, and you say, if you have a Latin text and English translations, you can start to figure out what English words correspond to Latin words in context. And you can see sometimes the Latin word oratio corresponds to speech, other times it corresponds to a prayer. And then you can learn from those contexts to generalize your ability to detect where oratio shows up as speech, where it shows up as prayer. And the basic idea is you can do this pretty well. We had support from the National Endowment for the Humanities to create what we call a dynamic lexicon to generate lexical meanings at scale. All right? And lots of details I'm going to skip through. But parallel text analysis is one of the cooler sets of technologies available. And so here's an example of tracing changes in terms, the change in word sense frequency over time, and lots of numbers that computer scientists care about. Well, let's just skip to the meat. Here is a radio. So if you just look at the raw frequency of this term, it's ambiguous. That doesn't tell you a lot, except that your OCR works reasonably well. But if you apply a number of one or more machine learning techniques, which I won't go into here, you can actually distinguish quite accurately the different uses. Now, if you think about oratio, speech versus prayer, that's a really important distinction. Because when oratio means speech, you have humanism. You have secular contexts. When oratio means prayer, you're looking at church Latin, or you're looking at a different kind of social context. So we're able to see here in this visualization, the higher dotted line is the absolute frequency of the word oratio, but the deep blue below represents that percentage of this overall frequency composed of where the word corresponds to prayer in English, and the light blue corresponds to or shows how often at any given time it corresponds to speech. And in this you can see the explosion of humanism at the end of the graph. That's a social change that emerges that you don't get from a simple Google Ngram viewer. This is a category of analysis made possible with new technologies, but possible with really bad OCR. This is not cleaned up. This is very uneven. You know better than me what happens when you've got 17th century Latin coming out the other end. And this is probably worse, I would imagine, than what you're doing, because this is just what the guys in California did, looking for 19th century cookbooks. Okay. Now, the challenge also comes in, so that's what you can do with OCR, and I'm going to go very quickly at this point, and because some of you actually heard about this last week in Texas. So one question is, how do you deal with a particular language that is a cultural heritage language that Hilde doesn't think is very important, or that doesn't rate very high but to the broad community, but matters a lot to someone? So it's the long tail. You have English and French and German. They do pretty well, and Italian probably. But what do you do with other languages? And so one of the challenges that we face is classical Greek. So for me, that's a bellwether. How well can you do Greek? Or how well can Greek be addressed? Tells me a lot about how customizable your system is, and whether it's an inflexible system or whether it can be adapted to the needs of particular communities. And so we've been able to make lots of progress, and I'm just going to skip through here. But we have reasonable OCR coming out. The key is to have multiple OCR engines, and the key is to have multiple open source OCR engines. Open source works because, well, I won't name a wonderful commercial product that we all depend upon, but the business plan did not allow for licensing that was reasonable for our context. Let's put it that way. So we spent a lot of time getting 3 OCR engines going that are open source to get reasonable results so we could run them on multiple CPUs and so on. Okay, so lots of work goes here. And then I'm just going to skip through my colleagues a couple miles away at Imperial College who are doing the scaling up. And you can see this as a flashing advertisement for Imperial College. They really know how to deal with stuff at scale. And they can spend an hour telling you all about this. But it's quite wonderful. And Brian Fuchs and John Darlington do a great job. And there you go. Okay, finally, conclusions. So what do we see what are you driving? You're developing increased intellectual range. And think about Greco-Roman antiquity. I've alluded to it a couple of times. One thinks of Greco-Roman antiquity in terms of, British, the Romans had British accents. We all know that because they were really British. And that Plato and Nato, Plato's our guy. But this is the most important classes of the 20th century. He was a Platonist, and when he created a republic, he modeled it on Plato's Republic. I've not met anyone who was able to analyze and think about the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran as a product of Platonic philosophy, which it is. And that is a terribly difficult problem because of the language issues. Okay, so when you're dealing with cultural heritage, you're really dealing with a network of cultures. And you're dealing with, it's not just European languages. You cannot do European culture without Arabic, period. It did not get here without Arabic. You would not be here. So you think if you have it licked for this side of the Mediterranean, you need more. It's just starting. Here are some classicists. My colleagues in Cairo, one of my favorite departments, the Kismat Latinia Yudunia, the Department of Greek and Latin Studies at the University of Cairo. And how do you deal with scholarship in Arabic, for example, or Chinese? And what we need is a decentralized lab culture in the humanities. And so you see instances of this showing up around the United States and North America. And we have these huge open collections that we have to deal with. This is the real challenge. And I think you're fairly abreast of this. So I'll go back to my first opening slide. What are the three basic changes? This transformation of the scale of questions. We need to engage more people than just professional library professionals, advanced scholars, and we need to think globally, even beyond Europe and North America. What you're doing here isn't just producing OCR data. What you're doing is really changing the world, changing connections around the world, changing the way people think about the world of which they are a part. You are enabling not just a transformation of the humanities, but the way in which the world as a whole, individual members of society, relate to their own cultural heritage. Parochially, I'm interested in Roman Britain, say if you're British, and globally, how did we get British culture, Dutch culture, whatever, how do we get here? And seeing what the connections are between your particular area and other areas. We can really, if we choose, and this is a choice, transform our ability to advance the intellectual life of society. That's what our mission is. It's not to write programs. It's not to write articles. This is what we're really trying to do, and you are at the center of it in working in OCR. This is the enabling technology. And so it's a real pleasure and honor to have a chance to say a few words to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There is not much time for questions, but we could take one.
You said that metadata are not always useful. You can tackle the problem with analyzing OCR. Could you emphasize a little bit on that?
Excuse me? So I know what was the question?
The question is, you said metadata are not always useful.
Yes, sir.
You can tackle the problem with analyzing OCR.
Oh.
I didn't understand.
Okay, and there are some of the, so, for example, what language is the book in? It's easier, you're better off taking the OCR output if it's usable at all, and this assumes some level of accuracy of the OCR output. You're better off running a language identifier, a language classifier on the contents of a book than you are looking at the library metadata saying what language that book is in. Because that, even on the dominant language of the book, that's often wrong in our experience. And of course, one language per book doesn't tell you page by page, much less paragraph by paragraph, what the language is. Likewise, I'm a big believer in named entity identification, finding people and places and dates, as telling you a lot about what's going on in a document, as opposed to, that you couldn't get from a conventional library metadata record, which is not, I don't want to dismiss, those of you who spent your lives doing library metadata, I don't want to say bad things about it in the ideal case. But there are limitations of that, and there are things we learn from OCR output that you can't get from that. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, if I may call you Greg. And just to say, we are excited that on the basis of what we've done in Impact, we also may now tackle Greek and Latin. We have discussed this a lot. But mind you, we have developed technology for 9 European languages, which was hard enough on its own, I must say. But of course we are aware of this, but it was really inspiring to hear you speak of what you will do with what we can create. And I hope we will collaborate in the future on this. Thank you very much.